1873, the American Builder's Companion assumed you already knew how to mix hydraulic cement from scratch. Not the ratio, the chemistry. The manual didn't explain what hydraulic meant. It didn't define slaking. It simply listed regional lime sources and expected you to proceed. The book sold 40,000 copies. By 1920, that same manual was republished with a footnote explaining that traditional methods are no longer widely taught. By 1950, the footnote became 2 pages. By 1980, the original instructions were moved to an appendix labeled Historical Reference Only. The gap isn't that we forgot one technique. It's that an entire assumption layer disappeared, a baseline of knowledge the 1870s took for granted, rode around, and never bothered to define. And it's not just cement. This is a documentary exploration of historical building practices, architectural literacy, and the transfer, or interruption, of technical knowledge across generations. We're not presenting conclusions. We're examining timing, scale, and the peculiar density of expertise that manuals from the 1870s assume without explanation. The evidence is architectural. The questions are structural. In 1868, Bicknell's village builder included a single diagram for corbelled vaulting. No measurements, no materials list, just an illustration with the caption, "Traditional Method." The assumption was clear: you'd seen it done. You'd worked under someone who knew. You didn't need the manual to teach you. You needed it to confirm. But confirmed against what? By the 1890s, American architecture schools started teaching vaulting as a lost European technique. The same methods Bicknell called traditional 20 years earlier were now considered specialized historical knowledge requiring academic instruction. The timeline is tight. The shift is sudden. Take the 1875 edition of Woodward's Country Homes. It includes floor plans for rural houses with built-in ventilation shafts, rainwater cisterns, and thermal mass walls designed to regulate temperature across seasons. These weren't mansion features. These were standard builds. The manual doesn't explain why you'd want these systems. It doesn't justify the extra labor. It assumes you already understand air flow, humidity control, and passive climate design, not as theory but as common practice. Yet by 1920, those same features were reintroduced as new innovations in sustainable building, often credited to European research from the 1910s. The knowledge didn't evolve. It cycled. In Britain, the pattern runs parallel. The 1872 Builder's Practical Guide references the usual ash-lime mortar without defining usual. It lists stone types by region and assumes you know which binder works with which aggregate. That's not a luxury of space. The book is 600 pages long. It has room to explain. It chooses not to, because explanation would have been redundant. The manual wasn't training beginners, it was referencing a shared vocabulary that readers brought with them. Except that vocabulary isn't recorded. It's not in apprenticeship logs. It's not in city records. Just assumed. The timing is what tightens the discomfort. Between 1865 and 1880, hundreds of building manuals were published across the United States and the United Kingdom. Almost all of them assume prior knowledge that isn't documented in earlier texts. They reference techniques without origin stories. They cite traditional methods that don't appear in records from 1800 or 1820. They build on a foundation of expertise that seems to arrive fully formed in the 1860s and begins fading by the 1890s. The manuals themselves don't acknowledge a gap. They write as if continuity is obvious. But when you try to trace that continuity backward, the thread goes cold. Here's what makes it architectural. In 1877, a construction supervisor in Manchester could walk onto a site and expect his crew to know how to fit stone without blueprints, just verbal instructions and regional custom. In 1897, the same site required engineering drawings, material specifications, and on-site supervision by certified professionals. The gap isn't just regulatory, it's operational. Something in the working knowledge of builders, the unwritten, inherited skill set that let them interpret minimal instructions, either disappeared or was deliberately replaced. The manuals document the before. The gap documents the after. What they don't document is the transition. Take the Erie Canal maintenance logs from 1869. They reference standard stone jointing and traditional lock mortaring without defining either term. The workers knew. By 1905, Those same canal systems required engineers to study historical methods because the original techniques were no longer in active use. The knowledge had professionalized, moved from trade practice to academic study. But what? If the methods worked, if the infrastructure still stood, if the labor force was continuous, what caused the break? The records don't say. The manuals don't transition. They just stop assuming. And it's not isolated. In Philadelphia, the 1874 Carpenter's Guide describes complex roof truss systems using terms like queen post assembly and compression bridging without diagrams. In London, the 1876 Practical Masonry does the same with barrel vaults and flying buttresses. Terms listed, methods assumed. In Boston, the 1878 Municipal Construction Standards reference traditional grading for streets and drainage without specifying slope, material, or compaction technique. All of them assume a literate audience. Not literate in reading, literate in building. And that literacy seems to have a shelf life. By 1890, the same publishers started adding glossaries. By 1900, they added introductory chapters. By 1910, the books had doubled in length, not with new techniques but with explanations of old ones. The baseline shifted. What was once assumed now needed teaching. What was once inherited now required institutional transfer. The architecture didn't change. The knowledge layer beneath it did. The manuals themselves become evidence, not of what people built, but of what they knew without being told. And the question isn't whether that knowledge existed. It's why it stopped transferring. The pattern becomes denser when you map it geographically. In 1871, the Pennsylvania Railroad published internal construction standards for bridge abutments, track beds, and station platforms. The manual is 70 pages. It references standard stone dressing 43 times. It never defines it once. The assumption, every regional crew already knows. But standard implies consistency. And consistency across state lines implies either centralized training or inherited practice, so uniform it didn't need documentation. The railroad employed over 50,000 workers across 12 states. They were building in granite regions, limestone regions, sandstone regions, each requiring different tools, different cutting angles, different jointing techniques. Yet the manual treats standard stone dressing as universal. That's not just confidence. That's literacy so widespread it didn't register as specialized knowledge. In Britain, the same year, the London and Northwestern Railway issued nearly identical standards. Same terminology, same assumptions, same unexplained references to traditional track laying and conventional grading. The two rail systems weren't formally coordinated. They didn't share training programs. Their manuals weren't cross-published. But they spoke the same technical language. Not in vocabulary, in assumption. In what they chose not to explain. Here's where the infrastructure pressure starts building. In 1875, the United States had 37,000 miles of municipal water mains. Most were installed between 1865 and 1875, a 10-year window. The construction manuals from that period describe pipe jointing, valve housing, and pressure regulation using terms like the usual method and according to standard practice. Standard according to what? There were no federal guidelines, no national engineering board, no centralized training authority. Yet cities from Boston to St. Louis to San Francisco installed hydraulic systems using compatible materials, similar pressure tolerances, and nearly identical distribution geometries. The systems weren't just functional. They were coordinated at a level that suggests shared expertise across regions that had no formal mechanism for sharing it. The Erie Canal offers the clearest example. Completed in 1825, it's often cited as a triumph of early American engineering. But the maintenance records from 1870 reveal something denser. The canal required constant repairs. Lock gates, stone linings, water control systems. These repairs were contracted to local crews, not centralized teams. Yet the work logs describe repairs using inherited stone fitting and traditional gate construction. The term inherited appears in 18 separate repair contracts between 1869 and 1877. Inherited from whom? The canal was 45 years old. The original builders were aging out or gone. Apprenticeships existed, but they weren't formalized. There was no Canal Builders Guild. No institution preserving technique. Yet the knowledge transferred seamlessly, until it didn't. By 1895, The same canal authority began hiring civil engineers to supervise repairs that local crews had handled independently for decades. The shift wasn't due to complexity. The infrastructure hadn't changed. The knowledge base had. In England, the story runs parallel with narrowboat canals. The 1873 maintenance contracts for the Grand Union Canal assume workers know traditional brickwork jointing for water retention and standard timber lock construction. By 1903, those same contracts included engineering diagrams and material specifications for techniques that had been performed from memory 30 years earlier. The infrastructure still worked. The original construction held. But the living memory of how it was done had professionalized or fragmented. Then there's the grain elevator problem. Between 1865 and 1880, hundreds of massive grain storage facilities were built across the American Midwest. These weren't simple barns. They were multi-story, fire-resistant, load-bearing structures designed to hold millions of pounds of grain while allowing controlled ventilation and pest management. The 1876 Grain Storage and Handling Manual assumes builders already understand load distribution for vertical storage, humidity control in timber structures, and fire-resistant mortar mixtures. It doesn't teach these. It references them. But where's the prior generation? Grain elevators of that scale didn't exist in 1840. The structures themselves represent an architectural leap, yet the manuals treat them as extensions of existing knowledge, not innovations. That suggests one of two things. Either the expertise transferred from a previous context we're not seeing in the record, or the baseline of architectural literacy in the 1870s was significantly higher than the documented timeline suggests. The administrative consistency is harder to dismiss. In 1872, the city of Philadelphia published zoning standards for building height, street width, and foundation depth. The document assumes compliance with traditional construction methods and standard materials per district. The same year, Manchester published nearly identical standards. Same ratios, same terminology, same assumptions about what builders would know without instruction. These weren't treaty cities. They didn't share governance. Their construction industries weren't formally linked. Yet the frameworks align. Not just in outcome, in expectation. In what they assume needs no explanation. By the 1880s, something starts shifting. The manuals get longer. The glossaries appear. The diagrams multiply. In 1883, the updated American Builder's Companion adds 16 pages of foundational explanations that the 1873 edition skipped entirely. Same publisher. Same audience. But now the assumption of prior knowledge is weakening. The 1889 British Builder's Reference does the same, doubles its introductory material and adds a section titled Basic Principles for New Practitioners. New practitioners. That phrasing didn't exist in the 1870s manuals. The concept of needing to teach basics wasn't operational. By 1890 it was. The question becomes, what happened in that 15-year window? Not to the buildings. They're still standing. Not to the infrastructure. It still functions. But to the knowledge transfer system. The unwritten, undocumented expertise that let a Philadelphia bricklayer and a Manchester stonemason read the same sparse instructions and arrive at the same result. That system either fragmented, professionalized, or was replaced by something requiring more institutional support. The manuals document the change. They don't explain it. And here's the scale pressure. If this were one city, one trade, one decade, it would be a curiosity. But it's transatlantic. It's multi-industry. It's compressed into a 20-year period where an entire generation of builders operated on assumed knowledge that wasn't recorded before them and wasn't transmitted after them. The gap isn't a loss of one technique. It's a shift in how technical knowledge was carried. The manuals were written for people who already knew. By 1900, they were being written for people who needed to learn. The architecture remained continuous. The knowledge didn't. Whether that reflects a natural professionalization of trades, the end of an oral transmission culture, or something about the 1870s generation specifically, the question doesn't resolve in the manuals. It just accumulates. The word Tartaria appears on maps from the 1700s and 1800s as a geographical label, a catch-all term for the vast interior regions of Asia that European cartographers knew little about. It wasn't a nation. It wasn't a unified empire. It was a placeholder for uncertainty. By the late 1800s, as those regions were explored and formalized into Russian territories, Chinese provinces and Central Asian Khanates, the label disappeared from maps. In recent years it's been repurposed, not as geography, but as interpretation, as a framework for reading architectural and infrastructural patterns that feel misaligned with the timelines we've inherited. The modern use of Tartaria isn't about proving a civilization. It's about naming a discomfort. There are three ways to interpret the evidence we've walked through. The first is institutional. The knowledge existed, was transmitted orally and through apprenticeship, and professionalized rapidly in the late 1800s as engineering schools, trade certifications, and centralized standards emerged. The gap we see in the manuals reflects that transition, from inherited craft to credentialed profession. This explains the administrative consistency, the transatlantic alignment, and the sudden need for glossaries by 1890. It doesn't fully explain why the baseline was so high in 1870, or why the transition happened so quickly. The second interpretation is infrastructural inheritance. The buildings, canals, water systems, and rail networks that manuals reference in the 1870s weren't new. They were continuations or restorations of earlier construction phases that aren't fully documented in the historical record. The expertise wasn't emerging. It was being applied to infrastructure that already existed or was being rebuilt using methods carried forward from an earlier period. This would explain the traditional and inherited language. It would explain the lack of origin stories in the manuals. It raises the question, inherited from when? The third interpretation is the one that uses Tartaria as shorthand. It suggests that the 1870s manuals document the tail end of a construction culture that was already fading, one that had built more earlier and at greater scale than the official chronology reflects. Under this reading, the manuals aren't teaching new methods. They're referencing the remnants of a knowledge system that was still operationally present in the 1860s and 1870s but had already begun losing institutional continuity. The name Tartaria becomes a placeholder, not for a specific empire but for the interpretive gap itself. All three models fit parts of the evidence. None fit all of it cleanly. The professionalization model explains the shift but not the starting point. The inheritance model explains the language but requires earlier construction we don't see in records. The Tartaria framework explains the unease but relies on absence as evidence. What brings it back to 1816 is the timing. The year without a summer, when volcanic ash from Mount Tambora disrupted global climate, collapsed harvests, and triggered mass displacement across Europe and North America. The following decades saw intense urbanization, infrastructure expansion, and institutional reorganization. By the 1860s, that expansion had stabilized. By the 1870s, the manuals began documenting what had been built. But they documented it as if it were already understood. The word Tartaria in its modern usage isn't a claim. It's a lens. It lets people say, this timeline feels compressed. This expertise feels inherited. This infrastructure feels overprepared. And rather than argue each point individually, the term becomes a frame, a way of holding the tension without resolving it. The manuals remain evidence, not of conspiracy, but of discontinuity. They document a generation of builders who assumed knowledge we can't trace backward and didn't successfully transfer forward. Whether that knowledge came from a previous construction era, an oral tradition we've lost access to, or a professionalized system that hadn't yet formalized. The gap is real. The buildings are still here. The canals still hold water. The railways still follow their original grades. But the knowledge that built them now requires archaeology. Not physical archaeology, documentary archaeology. The careful reconstruction of what people knew by examining what they didn't bother to explain. The 1870s manuals assumed you already understood. By 1920, that assumption had collapsed. The question isn't whether the knowledge existed. It's why the transfer broke. And whether what we call progress was built on something we've since had to relearn. The evidence doesn't demand belief. It invites examination. The manuals are available. The infrastructure is visible. The timeline is documented. What's missing is the continuity we expect to see. And sometimes, the absence of explanation is itself the pattern.